My name is Alice. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that require consistency more than charisma, strategy, planning, follow-through. I've been a project lead, a contributor, the person behind the spreadsheet that makes everyone else look prepared. If you passed me in a hallway, you probably wouldn't remember my face. People tend to describe me as calm, reliable, and low maintenance. It sounds like praise. Sometimes it is. Often, it's a way of saying they don't expect resistance. I've learned that when you move quietly, people assume you'll stay that way. This story isn't about outrage or revenge. It's not about a villain or a dramatic takedown. It's about what happens when expectations are rewritten without consent, and how power can shift without raising your voice. I was promised remote work, then terminated for not being in the office. That's the factual spine. The emotional story lives underneath it. When I accepted the role, the terms were clear. The offer letter said remote first. Later, HR said, policy update. If you've worked in modern corporate life, you already feel the tension in that sentence. This isn't a story about refusing to adapt or rejecting collaboration. It's about what it means when the rules change quietly, and the burden of adjustment falls on the person least inclined to argue. People often underestimate me because I don't announce my limits. I don't escalate early. I listen. I document. I wait. That waiting is sometimes mistaken for compliance. Other times it's mistaken for fear. In this story, you'll see how those assumptions formed and how they ultimately failed. What follows is a first-person account of a gradual unraveling. Small dismissals that seemed harmless on their own, a role I didn't choose but was assigned, and a moment when silence stopped being passive and became deliberate. There's no shouting match here. No leaked emails, no sudden luck or heroic speech. There is only sequence, clarity, and consequence. I'm sharing this not to warn you away from remote work, or to vilify a company, or to suggest that every policy change is a betrayal. I'm sharing it because many people, especially women who are competent and composed, are taught to absorb discomfort quietly and call it professionalism. We're told that being agreeable will protect us. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just makes it easier to overlook. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of your own experience. The meeting where your presence was optional until it wasn't. The expectation that flexibility only flows one way. The moment you realized you were being evaluated by standards you never agreed to. This is a story about noticing that moment and choosing what to do next without spectacle. I'll tell it honestly, calmly, without exaggeration, and I'll let the meaning emerge on its own. Before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever stayed quiet not because you agreed, but because you were still deciding what mattered most? When I first joined the company, I wasn't introduced with much ceremony. There was no announcement post, no team-wide email explaining who I was or why I mattered. I was added to calendars quietly, invited to recurring meetings with generic titles, and addressed with polite curiosity. Oh, you're the new ops person. Not the person, just a person. Functional, replaceable in theory. That suited everyone just fine. I came in as a senior operations program manager, but what that meant in practice was simple. I absorbed complexity so others didn't have to. I translated chaos into timelines. I noticed gaps before they became incidents. I followed up when enthusiasm wore off. People appreciated me in the way you appreciate good infrastructure. Only when it fails do you realize it was there at all. Because I worked remotely, there was an added layer of abstraction. I existed as a square on a screen, a voice that joined on time and left on time. I didn't linger after meetings. I didn't bump into executives at the coffee machine. I didn't participate in the small rituals that make someone feel real in an office. To them, I was efficient, dependable, and faintly distant. And I was fine with that. I'd chosen remote work deliberately. The offer letter said remote first. That phrase mattered to me, though at the time, I didn't realize how much. It meant my work would be evaluated by output, not proximity. It meant I could build my days around focus instead of performance. I didn't want visibility. I wanted clarity. In meetings, I spoke when I had something precise to add. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't interrupt. That made me easy to overlook when louder voices took up space, but it also meant that when I did speak, people listened, briefly, efficiently, then moved on. Decisions were often framed as collaborative, but the direction was usually preset. My role was to make it work. Over time, a pattern emerged in how people talked about me. Alice will handle it. Let's check with Alice. She's very organized. There was warmth in their tone, but also finality. I wasn't seen as someone whose opinion might change the course of things, just someone who would ensure the course stayed smooth. I noticed that no one asked me what I wanted next. Career conversations happened around me, not with me. When restructuring was discussed, I was included for execution, not strategy. It wasn't malicious. It was habitual. I had been placed mentally in a category that felt safe to everyone else, invisible but essential. I didn't push back because nothing felt wrong enough yet. My performance reviews were solid. My feedback was positive, if vague. Steady. Low drama. Easy to work with. These were framed as strengths. I accepted them as such, even when I sensed the quiet ceiling they created. From the outside, I probably looked fortunate. A stable role, remote flexibility, trust. From the inside, I was aware of how conditional that trust was. It existed as long as I didn't ask for too much definition, as long as I didn't challenge assumptions, as long as I remained useful in the way they expected. I watched others advocate loudly for themselves and saw how that changed the air in the room. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it backfired. I learned early in my career that I wasn't interested in that kind of friction. I believed, honestly, that consistency would speak for itself. What I didn't fully understand then was how quickly consistency becomes entitlement in other people's minds, how being dependable can turn into being taken for granted, how silence can be interpreted not as thoughtfulness, but as agreement. At that stage, I still believed the system was neutral, that if I kept delivering, the terms under which I delivered would be respected. I believed that written agreements meant something. Those roles didn't shift without conversation. That if expectations changed, someone would sit down and explain why. That belief shaped how I showed up every day, prepared, calm, unassuming. It also shaped how they saw me. And that version of me, the one who never made things difficult, was about to be tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. The first time it happened, it was so minor I almost didn't register it as anything at all. It came at the end of a routine meeting. One of those cross-functional check-ins where half the attendees are multitasking and the other half are waiting for their turn to speak. We were wrapping up, people already dropping off the call, when my manager said casually, "Oh, starting next month, we'll probably want people in the office a bit more. Just a heads up. No details, no follow-up. Just a sentence, delivered lightly, like a weather update." I remember the exact moment because of how my body reacted before my mind did. A small tightening in my chest. A pause in my note-taking. I looked down at my calendar as if the answer might be written there. It wasn't. I didn't say anything. Neither did anyone else. After the call, I sat at my desk longer than usual, rereading the offer letter I'd saved in a folder labeled onboarding. The language was still there, unchanged. Remote first. Not remote friendly. Not hybrid. Remote first. I told myself this was probably about culture, not policy. Maybe they wanted more face time for new hires. Maybe it didn't apply to me. That was the first rationalization. A week later, an email arrived from HR. Subject line, policy update. The tone was neutral, almost apologetic. It talked about evolving collaboration needs and aligning teams. It didn't mention roles. It didn't mention exceptions. It didn't mention enforcement. It simply stated that employees were now expected to be in the office 3 days a week. I read it twice, then a third time more slowly. There was no acknowledgement of existing agreements, no reference to remote first language, just a new expectation, presented as inevitable. Still, I didn't respond. I watched the reactions in Slack instead. Some people joked about traffic, others complained openly. A few asked clarifying questions. I noticed that the loudest objections came from people whose roles were already highly visible. Managers, senior engineers, people with leverage that was obvious and frequently exercised. No one tagged me. No one asked how this affected me. In a strange way, that felt consistent. I wasn't seen as someone who needed accommodation. I was seen as someone who would adjust. When my manager followed up, it was in a one-on-one, framed as concern. "I just want to make sure you're okay with the change," he said. "It's kind of coming from above." I told him I was reviewing the details, that my role had been remote first when I joined. I said it calmly without accusation. He nodded, but his attention drifted. Yeah, totally. HR's still figuring out how it all applies. I wouldn't worry too much about it. That was the second rationalization. It's temporary confusion. So I waited. I kept working. I started documenting more carefully than usual, saving emails, noting dates. Not because I was planning anything, but because something in me had shifted from trust to observation. I wanted a clear record, just in case clarity became necessary. Weeks passed. The expectation hardened. Calendars started filling with in-person meetings. Comments like, "We'll cover this when you're here," slipped into conversation. I was excluded from a few informal discussions that happened after office meetings ended. Nothing critical, nothing obvious, just enough to notice. I asked HR directly how the new policy interacted with my original agreement. The response was polite, brief, and noncommittal. "We consider all roles subject to evolving business needs," they wrote. "Remote arrangements are reviewed periodically." No acknowledgement of remote first. No explanation of what was reviewed meant. That was the moment that the cut became visible. It wasn't deep. It didn't bleed. But it changed how I stood. I realized that what I thought was a shared understanding was, in their eyes, a flexible preference. And that flexibility only moved in one direction. Everyone else seemed to move on. The noise died down. The jokes stopped. People adapted. I did too, but differently. I stopped assuming good faith by default. I stopped filling in gaps with optimism. I started paying attention to what was said and what was carefully left unsaid. At the time, it still felt like something that could be smoothed over. A misunderstanding, a policy growing pain. I told myself it wasn't worth escalating, that staying calm and reasonable would eventually lead to a reasonable outcome. What I didn't realize was that by not pushing back immediately, I was being quietly reclassified. Not as someone with terms to respect, but as someone whose terms could be rewritten. And once that happens, it's very hard to reverse. At first, the changes announce themselves. A policy email, a comment in a meeting, a calendar invite that assumed physical presence. But after a while, they stopped announcing anything at all. The new expectations simply became the background noise of daily work, and the absence of objection was treated as acceptance. That's how normalization works. Not through force, but through repetition. I noticed it in the language people used. "When you're in next week, we'll catch up in person." These phrases slid into conversations as if they had always been there. Each time, I felt a brief internal resistance, small enough to ignore, easy to rationalize away. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that this was just how organizations evolved. I started going into the office occasionally, spacing the days out, choosing the least disruptive times. I framed it as flexibility on my part, proof that I was a team player. No one acknowledged the effort. No one said thank you. They simply updated their expectations. That's when I realized something important. Compromise. When it's one-sided, doesn't read as generosity. It reads as availability. My commute was long and unnecessary for the kind of work I did. When I was in the office, I sat in the same video calls I would have joined from home, except now with noise-canceling headphones and a sense of dislocation. The collaboration they claimed to want didn't materialize. What did materialize was visibility, being seen at a desk even if no one engaged with me while I was there. Still, I said nothing. In one meeting, a senior leader joked, "Well, now that we've got everyone back where we can see them." I smiled politely on camera, though I was physically in the room. The comment wasn't aimed at me, but it included me. I felt myself shrinking slightly, as if my presence had become symbolic rather than substantive. I began to notice how often decisions were justified with phrases like, "That's just how it is now." No rationale, no discussion, just finality. When I asked clarifying questions, they were answered vaguely or redirected. "We're still figuring it out." Leadership alignment. Business needs. Each phrase was a closed door. I rationalized my silence by telling myself I was being professional, that pushing back would make me seem difficult, that I could absorb this inconvenience because I was capable. I told myself that things evened out over time, that organizations corrected course when they saw unintended consequences. What I didn't say out loud was that I was tired, not physically, but ethically. tired of translating ambiguity into effort, tired of being adaptable without being consulted, tired of holding up my end of an agreement that no one else seemed interested in honoring. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when a colleague asked if I could adjust my schedule to be in earlier, since you're already commuting now. It was said kindly, without malice. I agreed, because saying no felt like making a fuss. Afterward, I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving home, trying to understand why that question bothered me more than it should have. The answer was simple. My presence had become assumed. My flexibility had been converted into an obligation. And still, I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I documented. I saved screenshots of calendar invites that conflicted with remote work. I noted dates when expectations shifted without notice. I kept my tone neutral in writing, my questions precise. I didn't accuse. I asked for clarification. The responses were always polite, always vague. I watched as others pushed back successfully, negotiating hybrid exceptions, adjusting their days, carving out arrangements that worked for them. They had conversations I wasn't invited into. Their leverage was visible. Mine was quieter, less obvious, and apparently easier to ignore. Over time, the original agreement, the one that brought me here, began to feel like a private memory rather than a shared contract. Something I remembered clearly, and they seemed to have forgotten entirely. That's when I understood that disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as indifference, as the steady erosion of boundaries you thought were understood. By the time I admitted to myself that this wasn't temporary confusion, but a new normal, I was already being evaluated by standards I hadn't agreed to, standards that assumed my compliance. And the most unsettling part was how easy it had been for everyone, including me, to let that happen. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand the role they had assigned me. Not the one in my job description, but the one in their minds. I was the steady one, the adaptable one, the person who didn't make waves. If something needed to be handled quietly, efficiently, without escalation, it came to me. I was the buffer between ambition and reality, the person who absorbed last-minute changes and smoothed them into something workable. In other words, I was useful. That usefulness came with an unspoken expectation. I would continue to accommodate whatever the organization needed, without requiring the organization to accommodate me in return. My calm demeanor wasn't interpreted as professionalism anymore. It was interpreted as consent. I saw it clearly during a planning session where leadership discussed resourcing constraints. My name came up, not in the context of growth or advancement, but as a solution. Alice can probably take this on, someone said. Not asked, stated. No one looked at me when they said it. I was there, physically in the room, taking notes. I wrote the sentence down word for word in my notebook, not out of spite, out of recognition. This was the role: reliable, invisible, expandable. When questions of fairness arose, about workload, about expectations, about who was being asked to do what, the answers were always framed around resilience. She can handle it. She's flexible. These were compliments, but they functioned as justification. I noticed that when I did express a boundary, however gently, it was treated as an exception rather than a norm. Of course, people would say, surprised. We didn't realize. And then slowly, the expectation would creep back in, slightly altered, as if my boundary had been a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent line. I started to understand that the organization didn't see me as someone whose needs had to be balanced. They saw me as someone whose needs could be deferred indefinitely. The remote work issue was just one expression of this. It wasn't about location. It was about control, about who got to define the terms of engagement and who was expected to adapt quietly when those terms shifted. I also realized something else, more uncomfortable. I had helped train them to see me this way. Every time I said yes without clarification. Every time I absorbed a change without documenting its impact. Every time I prioritized harmony over precision. I told myself I was being mature. What I was really doing was making it easy for them not to think too hard about the consequences of their decisions. There was no villain assigning me this role. It emerged organically, reinforced by small interactions, by my own reluctance to be perceived as difficult, by their comfort with my silence. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Meetings took on a different tone. When someone spoke over me, I noticed. When my contributions were summarized by someone else and presented as their own, I noticed. When decisions were made in rooms I wasn't invited into, but executed by me afterward, I noticed. I didn't react, I observed. The gap between how I saw myself and how they saw me widened. I saw someone who had entered into an agreement in good faith and upheld it meticulously. They saw someone whose reliability could be stretched without consequence. That's the danger of being low maintenance. People forget maintenance is still required. I remember standing in the office one afternoon, looking around at desks that were half occupied, listening to the low hum of conversation. I felt strangely out of place, not because I didn't belong, but because I realized I was there to be seen, not to be heard. My presence was symbolic proof of compliance. That was the moment I stopped hoping the role would correct itself. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. If I continued as I was, nothing would change. The role I had been assigned would harden into permanence, and any future objection would be framed as a disruption rather than a correction. So I made a quiet decision, not to confront, not to escalate, not to dramatize, just to stop performing the version of myself they had come to expect. The shift didn't happen during a meeting or a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic email thread. It happened on an ordinary morning, in the space between noticing and deciding. I was in the office that day because my calendar assumed I would be. I arrived early, as I often did when commuting, and sat at a desk that wasn't really mine. Hot desking had become another quiet norm. I set up my laptop, adjusted my chair, and waited for the first meeting to start. While I waited, I opened my notebook, the leather-bound one I'd been carrying with me since my first week. I wasn't looking for anything specific, I just started flipping through pages. There it was, in my own handwriting, the date of my offer acceptance, the phrase remote first underlined, a note I'd written to myself about how that flexibility would allow me to do my best work. How grateful I'd felt for the clarity of it. I sat there longer than necessary, rereading that page. Something about seeing it in my own words, untouched by revisions or reinterpretation, made the situation impossible to minimize. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a quiet breach, not malicious perhaps, but real. As the office filled up, I noticed how little my presence changed anything. People passed by without stopping. Conversations happened around me, not with me. When the meeting started, it was on video anyway, even though half of us were in the same building. I spoke twice. Both times, my points were acknowledged with polite nods and then set aside. In that moment, the discomfort I'd been carrying crystallized into something simpler: certainty. I didn't belong in this version of the arrangement. Not because I was above it, but because it wasn't what I had agreed to, and more importantly, because staying silent was no longer neutral. It was participation. I felt an unexpected calm settle in. Not relief exactly, more like alignment, the kind you feel when you stop arguing with yourself. I stopped trying to make the situation comfortable. I didn't vent, I didn't rehearse conversations in my head. I just observed with a different lens. Instead of asking, how do I adapt to this? I asked, what does this actually require of me now? The answer wasn't confrontation. It wasn't compliance either. It was clarity. I left the office that afternoon at a reasonable hour and didn't rush to justify it. On the drive home, I didn't replay the day. I thought about sequence, what had happened, in what order, and what had been documented. I thought about the difference between policy and agreement, between expectation and consent. That evening, I organized my notes. Not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. I created a timeline: offer letter, onboarding, policy email, and conversations. I saved copies in a folder labeled simply record. This wasn't preparation for a fight. It was preparation for accuracy. I also stopped filling in gaps with assumptions. If something was unclear, I noted it as such. If someone made a verbal request that contradicted written policy, I followed up in writing, neutrally, just confirming my understanding. For alignment. The language of professionalism is used precisely. I didn't change my tone at work. I changed my posture. Silence, I realized, could be many things: avoidance, deference, or intention. Up until then, mine had been a mix of the first two. That day, it became the third. No one noticed the shift immediately. There was no reason they would. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still calm, still responsive, still doing my job. But internally, the rules were different. I was no longer waiting for the situation to resolve itself. I was no longer assuming goodwill would correct misalignment. I had accepted that if something was going to change, it would be because I changed how I engaged with it. That acceptance didn't make me angry. It made me patient. Once the internal shift happened, my silence changed character. Before, it had been reactive. An instinct to avoid conflict, to preserve harmony, to give people the benefit of the doubt. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. I still didn't argue, but I also didn't volunteer emotional labor to smooth over contradictions that weren't mine to resolve. I spoke less, but I listened more carefully. When expectations were implied rather than stated, I asked for clarification, briefly, in writing. When decisions were made without context, I requested documentation, not challengingly, just enough to make the process visible. My questions were calm, but they slowed things down. They required someone else to be precise. That alone changed the dynamic. People are comfortable with flexibility when it costs them nothing. Precision, on the other hand, demands accountability. I watched as conversations became more cautious around me. Not hostile, just more careful. I wasn't confrontational. I was exact. In meetings, I stopped filling the silence. I let unclear statements hang in the air until someone else clarified them. When tasks were assigned ambiguously, I summarized them in follow-up notes, outlining scope and assumptions. If something wasn't defined, I labeled it as such. No one accused me of being difficult, but the easy flow I'd once provided, the quiet absorption of friction, was gone. They mistook this change for detachment. I heard it in side comments. Alice seems quieter lately. She's very heads down. Maybe she's just adjusting. The assumption was that I was retreating, that the pressure had made me smaller. In reality, I was becoming more intentional about where my energy went. I stopped compensating for organizational ambiguity with personal effort. If a meeting ran over because decisions weren't made, I didn't stay late to fix it. If a request conflicted with documented agreements, I asked for alignment before proceeding. I didn't refuse. I paused. That pause was new. What surprised me most was how uncomfortable it made people. Not angry, unsettled. Accustomed to my reliability, they had built plans around my quiet compliance. When that compliance became conditional on clarity, timelines stretched, responsibilities became visible. Still, no one connected this to the remote work issue. They saw it as a mood, a phase, perhaps even a lack of engagement. No one asked directly what had changed. Asking would have required acknowledging that something might be wrong. And I wasn't going to explain it to them. My silence now had structure. It wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space for others to reveal how much they had relied on me not asking questions. Space for processes to show their weaknesses. I continued to meet expectations. Documented ones, I didn't exceed them, I didn't underperform. I simply performed exactly to spec. That kind of compliance is often more disruptive than rebellion. There was a moment when my manager asked if everything was okay. I said yes. That I was focused on alignment and sustainability. Both true. He nodded, relieved, and moved on. They still thought I was playing the same role, just more quietly. What they didn't see was that I was mapping dependencies, tracking how decisions flowed, noticing where information was bottlenecked, and who depended on my silence to keep things moving. I wasn't gathering leverage in a dramatic sense. I was understanding the system as it actually operated, not as it claimed to. Silence, when chosen, sharpens perception. And in that sharpened state, I began to see something they had never noticed at all. What they never noticed was how much of the system ran through quiet hands. Not just mine, but people like me. The ones who don't posture, who doesn't broadcast influence, who doesn't announce when something is fragile. We're the connective tissue, invisible until strained. As I moved more deliberately, patterns emerged with uncomfortable clarity. I saw how often decisions were made without full information, because the people with that information weren't in the room or weren't invited to speak. I saw how frequently timelines depended on assumptions that only held because someone, somewhere, was compensating quietly. I saw how risk was redistributed downward, masked as flexibility. And I saw how often that someone was me. Because I had stopped smoothing things over automatically, small fractures appeared. Nothing catastrophic, just delays, re-asks, follow-ups that had to be answered twice, the kind of friction that forces attention. I began to document not just what was said, but what was required to make it true. When a leader committed to a delivery date, I noted what inputs were missing. When priorities shifted, I tracked what had been deprioritized without acknowledgement. When a meeting ended with, "We'll figure it out later," I wrote down who we actually were. This wasn't preparation for blame, it was preparation for reality. I noticed that my role intersected with nearly every team in some way. I had historical context that no one else had bothered to compile. I knew which processes were informal but critical, which relationships carried unspoken authority, which approvals were symbolic, and which were necessary. Because I had never used that knowledge to assert myself, it had gone unnoticed. It was assumed to be ambient, background. The irony was that the more invisible my work became, the more essential it was. I also noticed something else: how much of the push for in-office presence relied on optics rather than outcomes. Attendance was tracked loosely and enforcement inconsistently. The real pressure wasn't about productivity, it was about signaling alignment. Being seen mattered more than being effective. And yet, the work still had to get done. When something slipped, it was quietly rerouted to the people who always caught things before they fell. People like me. I didn't point this out. I let the contrast speak for itself. I continued to respond promptly. I met deadlines. I participated. But I stopped compensating for gaps that weren't acknowledged. If a process failed because assumptions were wrong, I documented the failure without emotional language. Just facts. Sequence. Impact. Over time, my records became comprehensive, not just of my own role, but of how decisions cascaded. I could trace outcomes back to moments of ambiguity, to missing approvals, to assumptions made in rooms I wasn't in. None of this was secret, it was just dispersed. What they never noticed was that while they were watching for resistance, I was building a map, not a plan, a map. A clear, unemotional representation of how things actually worked, who depended on whom, where policy contradicted practice, where agreements had been overridden without process. I didn't share this map. I didn't hint at it. There was no benefit in doing so prematurely. Power doesn't announce itself. It waits until it's needed. And the longer I waited, the clearer it became that the system had grown comfortable relying on my discretion, assuming I would always choose harmony over accuracy. They didn't notice the moment when I stopped making that choice. By the time they would need to understand what I knew, the conditions would already be set. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden discovery, no single document that changed everything. It arrived gradually, then all at once, the way understanding often does when you've been circling it long enough. I was reviewing my records one evening, cross-referencing dates and language, when I noticed how clean the timeline had become. Offer letter, onboarding notes, performance reviews, policy email, verbal assurances, gradual enforcement. Each step was reasonable on its own. Together, they told a different story. Not of malice, but of exposure. The company hadn't just shifted expectations. They had done so without process, without consent, and without reconciliation with existing agreements. The more I laid it out, the clearer it became that the ambiguity they relied on wasn't accidental. It was functional. What I realized privately was that the leverage wasn't in confrontation. It wasn't even in policy. It was in coherence. I could articulate with precision how my role had been redefined without discussion, how compliance had been assumed, how performance expectations had remained unchanged while working conditions had shifted materially, and how that shift had disproportionately affected me because of the very traits they valued: reliability, adaptability, discretion. None of this was emotional. That was the key. Emotion would have weakened the case. What I had instead was alignment between written agreements, observed behavior, and documented impact. A narrative that didn't need exaggeration to be compelling. I also understood something else. I didn't need to prove intent. I only needed to demonstrate the effect. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about removing their ability to dismiss you. In that moment, I felt no urge to act immediately, no satisfaction, just clarity, the kind that settles your breathing and sharpens your focus. I knew with certainty that the situation was no longer about whether I could adapt. It was about whether I should. I didn't share this realization with anyone, not my manager, not HR, not colleagues. It wasn't time. Leverage matures when it's left undisturbed. I continued working as before, outwardly unchanged. But internally, I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer hoping for correction. I was evaluating outcomes. The reveal wasn't that I had been wronged. It was then that I finally understood the shape of my agency and how quietly it could be exercised. Once you see your options clearly, pretending you don't have a choice becomes impossible. That was where I found myself. Not in crisis, not in anger, but at a decision point that felt heavier precisely because it was calm. I laid the options out the way I lay everything out. Without drama, without self-deception, I could comply fully. Move my life around the office, except that remote first had been quietly redefined out of existence. Perform presence, not just work. Hope that consistency would eventually be rewarded, or at least noticed. I could confront the issue directly. Escalate. Demand recognition of the original agreement. Force a conversation that everyone else had been avoiding. That path promised clarity, but it also promised friction. And I knew exactly how someone like me would be framed if I took it. Not as principled, as inflexible. Or I could choose the option no one seemed to imagine I would take. I could stop negotiating the terms altogether. What made this decision irreversible wasn't the risk. It was the honesty it required. I had to admit to myself that staying under these conditions would mean accepting a version of my professional identity that no longer fit. It would mean teaching them, conclusively, that my boundaries were optional. That realization didn't feel empowering, it felt sobering. I thought about timing, about sequence, about how decisions ripple outward. I thought about the systems I had mapped, the dependencies I had noticed, the quiet ways my absence would be felt. Not immediately, but eventually. I also thought about dignity, not pride. Dignity is quieter than that. It's the ability to recognize when an arrangement no longer honors mutual respect, even if it remains polite on the surface. I didn't rush the decision. I let it sit. I observed a little longer, just to be sure I wasn't reacting to a bad week or a bruised ego. But nothing changed. The assumptions are held. The pressure remained asymmetric. So I chose the option that preserved my clarity, even if it cost me comfort. I decided to move forward in a way that required no permission. No announcement, no ultimatum, just alignment between what I knew and how I acted next. Once that decision was made, everything else became simpler. Not easier, but simpler. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself to anyone. Explanation invites debate, and I wasn't interested in debate. I was interested in execution. So I moved quietly. I started by separating emotion from action. Whatever frustration I had stayed private, processed on long walks, or written into pages no one else would read. What guided my next steps was the sequence. Order mattered. I reviewed my records again, this time not to understand what had happened, but to ensure accuracy if I ever needed it. Dates aligned, language was clean, nothing speculative, nothing reactive. Just a clear trail of how expectations had shifted without discussion, and how compliance had been assumed. Then I prepared for outcomes. I didn't tell my manager I was reconsidering my future. I didn't hint to colleagues that I was unhappy. I showed up exactly as expected. No more, no less. I met deadlines. I responded promptly. I remained outwardly the same dependable presence. That consistency was important. It removed noise. Behind the scenes, I updated my professional materials carefully. Not urgently, not emotionally. I didn't apply everywhere. I was selective. I looked for roles that described boundaries clearly, not aspirationally, where language matched reality. At the same time, I adjusted how I worked internally. I stopped initiating fixes for problems that hadn't been acknowledged. If something required a decision, I waited for it. If a request lacked context, I asked for it. Calmly. In writing. Nothing I did violated expectations. But the invisible scaffolding I'd been providing, unasked, uncredited, was no longer there. No one noticed at first. That's the thing about systems built on quiet labor. They don't register its absence immediately. There's a lag, a delay between cause and effect. People assume the slowdown is temporary, that someone else will step in. I also began declining office days that weren't explicitly required, referencing workload and focus. I didn't argue policy. I followed it exactly as written. The ambiguity they relied on now worked against them. There was no confrontation, no meeting titled concerns, just small recalibrations that made my position precise and my availability finite. If someone had asked me directly what I was doing, I would have answered honestly. I was aligning my actions with the terms that were actually being upheld, but no one asked. They were still operating on an older version of me, the one who absorbed discomfort without signaling it. By the time they realized something had changed, the movement was already underway, and silence once again did its work. The first signs were subtle, almost deniable. A meeting that ended without a clear next step. A follow-up email that asked questions I usually answered before anyone noticed they needed asking. A deadline that slipped, not dramatically, just enough to require explanation. None of it pointed to me directly. That was important. The system didn't break, it wavered. I watched the confusion ripple outward, slow and uncertain. People double-checked assumptions. Responsibilities were reread. Someone asked, "Wait, who owns this now?" The answer used to be obvious. Now it wasn't. I didn't step in. Instead, I responded exactly to what was asked. Nothing more. If someone needed clarification, I provided it. If someone asked for help, I scoped it. If a decision was missing, I named that absence and waited. This wasn't withdrawal, it was accurate. What surprised me was how quickly others felt the weight of what I had been carrying quietly for so long. Without my automatic translation of ambiguity into action, friction became visible. Meetings ran longer. Follow-ups multiplied. Small inefficiencies are stacked into noticeable delays. I heard it in passing comments. Things feel slower lately. We keep circling on this. Didn't this used to be easier? No one said my name, but my absence was being felt. At the same time, pressure increased around office presence. Attendance was checked more carefully. Reminders were sent. The tone sharpened slightly, not hostile but firmer. It was as if leadership sensed a loss of control and reached for the most visible lever they had. Presence. I complied with what was explicitly required. Nothing more, nothing less. When asked to be in the wanted to be in the office, I asked for a purpose. When none was provided, I documented the request and followed policy as written. This too slowed things down. The irony wasn't lost on me. The policy meant to increase alignment was now creating more work, more friction, more confusion. But because the pressure was diffuse, no one could point to a single cause. People began to feel the loss without understanding it. That's often how quiet dominance works. Not by asserting power, but by withdrawing unacknowledged support. By letting the system experience the reality it had been insulated from. My manager scheduled a check-in. He asked how I was feeling about things. I told him I was focused on sustainability and clarity. He nodded, concerned but unsure what to ask next. There was nothing to fix yet. Nothing had gone wrong in a way that justified intervention. But something had shifted. And once momentum changes direction, it rarely announces itself. By the time concern sharpened into urgency, the window for simple fixes had already closed. I could feel it in the tone of communication before anyone said it outright. Messages became more frequent, more carefully worded. Meetings that had once been optional were suddenly mandatory. Leadership started asking questions they should have asked months earlier, about scope, about ownership, about why certain things now took longer than expected. They weren't panicking, not yet. They were confused. Confusion is uncomfortable in organizations built on the illusion of control. When systems slow down, the instinct is to tighten the grip, not to reflect. And that's exactly what happened. Policies were reiterated. Expectations were restated, more firmly this time, as if volume could substitute for consent. I watched this from a steady distance. HR sent another message clarifying in-office requirements. The language was more explicit now, less flexible. It read like a correction, not a conversation. There was still no acknowledgement of prior agreements, just a sense of this is how it is now. That was when I knew the opportunity for reconciliation had passed. If someone had sat down with me earlier, really sat down and said, "We need to revisit this, and here's why," the story might have ended differently. I was never opposed to change. I was opposed to erasure. Now the response was procedural, not relational, and procedures don't restore trust. They replace it. My manager asked if I could increase my office days just for the next few weeks, while things stabilized. I asked what would change after that period. He didn't have an answer. That question lingered between us unanswered. The organization was trying to fix a systemic issue with surface-level enforcement. They wanted visibility without addressing the underlying misalignment, and because they didn't fully understand where the strain was coming from. Every attempt to correct it missed the mark. I could see the path they were on clearly: more pressure, more compliance, more quiet attrition. What they didn't realize was that I had already stepped out of the cycle emotionally. I wasn't resisting, I wasn't hoping, I wasn't waiting. I had already chosen. There's a particular calm that comes when you know the ending, even if no one else does. You stop reacting to urgency that isn't yours. You stop trying to save situations that no longer include you. When HR requested a formal acknowledgement of the updated policy, I responded neutrally, asking for clarification on how it intersected with my original agreement. The response came back templated, impersonal, and final. That was the last confirmation I needed. The moment for repair had been earlier, when the cuts were small, when the cost of listening was low. Now, everything was framed as enforcement. And enforcement is not a foundation. It's a signal that trust has already failed. By the time they realized something irreversible was in motion, it was no longer something a meeting could solve. It was already too late to fix it the way they wanted to. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It was scheduled as a quick sync. No warning, no agenda, just a calendar invite from HR, with my manager included. I accepted it without hesitation. There was nothing left to prepare. When the call started, the tone was professional, almost careful. HR spoke first, outlining expectations around in-office presence and alignment with updated policy. The words were familiar by now, polished, impersonal. When they finished, there was a pause, an invitation to respond. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't interrupt. I thanked them for the clarity. Then I laid out the sequence calmly and precisely. The offer letter language, the timeline of changes, the lack of consultation, the impact on how my role had been evaluated since. I didn't accuse anyone of bad intent. I didn't argue policy. I simply described what had happened in order and what that meant for me. Silence followed, not defensive silence, processing silence. HR asked a few clarifying questions. I answered them directly. My manager looked uncomfortable, not angry, not hostile, just caught between narratives. What I noticed most was how little heat there was in the room. No one escalated. No one denied facts. There was nothing to fight about. The misalignment was visible, undeniable, and inconvenient. They asked what I wanted. That question arrived too late to carry weight. I told them I wanted what I had always wanted: alignment between agreement and expectation. I said it evenly, without attachment. I also said that based on the current direction, I didn't see a path where that alignment existed. No ultimatum, no threat, just a statement. HR suggested options: transitional arrangements, temporary flexibility, and future reviews. Each one required me to accept uncertainty in exchange for compliance. I listened, then declined, politely. The conversation ended without resolution. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a mutual understanding that something fundamental no longer matched. When the call ended, I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. The confrontation had done what it needed to do. Not force change, but confirm reality. When I look back at who I was at the beginning of this story, I don't feel embarrassment, I feel compassion. She believed that clarity would be honored if she were consistent enough. Those agreements once made had weight, that professionalism meant absorbing discomfort quietly. Those beliefs weren't naive. They were taught, reinforced, rewarded, until they weren't. Who I am now is not harder or colder, I'm clearer. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I understand that silence can be generous, but it can also be instructional. And that is when you are always the one making things easier. You are often the one teaching others that ease is your obligation. I still work quietly. I still document. I still listen more than I speak. But I don't offer invisibility as a service anymore. My sense of identity is less tied to being useful and more grounded in being aligned. I choose environments that respect definition, not just intention, where change is discussed, not imposed, where flexibility flows both ways, or it doesn't flow at all. There's no bitterness in this shift. Bitterness requires fixation, and I've moved past that. What remains is discernment. I've learned that power doesn't always look like assertion. Sometimes it looks like refusal without drama, like stepping out of a role that no longer fits and letting the system feel the shape of your absence. I don't measure success now by how indispensable I am. I measure it by how replaceable I'm allowed to be without being erased. That distinction matters. The experience didn't make me cynical. It made me precise. And precision, I've learned, is a form of respect for yourself and for others. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to look for a lesson that feels neat, a rule you can apply universally. Something reassuring like always speak up early or never trust corporate promises. But real experiences are rarely that clean, and this one isn't either. The truth is more uncomfortable and more useful. Agreements don't disappear all at once. They fade when they're treated as flexible for one side and fixed for the other. Disrespect doesn't usually announce itself as hostility. It shows up as convenience. As a quiet decision, this person will adjust, because they always have. What made this situation irreversible wasn't the policy change itself. It was the refusal to acknowledge what had been lost in the change, the insistence on compliance without conversation, the assumption that calm meant consent. And my response wasn't heroic. I didn't outsmart anyone. I didn't win in a dramatic sense. I simply stopped participating in a version of the story that required me to shrink my own clarity. That's the part I want to be honest about. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over yourself, over what you normalize, over what you allow to become just how it is. Sometimes the most consequential choice you make is not to argue harder, but to step away cleanly, to let alignment or the lack of it speak for itself. If you're listening to this and feeling unsettled, that makes sense. Many of us were taught that being agreeable was the same as being professional, that endurance was a virtue, and that asking for clarity too often made us difficult. We were rewarded for making things work, even when the terms quietly shifted against us. But here's what I've learned. Systems don't change when the cost of imbalance is hidden. They change when that cost becomes visible. And sometimes, the only way to make it visible is to stop paying it yourself. I didn't leave angry. I left aligned. With my values, with my work style, with my understanding of what mutual respect actually looks like. That alignment is quieter than vindication, but it lasts longer. So I'll leave you with this. And I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that your silence was being mistaken for agreement? And what did you do when you finally saw that clearly?